going to dig into the Bible now, carrying on in our series looking at the whole story of the Bible. We've covered parts 1, 2 and 3, which were creation, the fall and the patriarchs. And today we're on part 4, which is called Out of Egypt.
Yes, Out of Egypt. So today we're in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy and Joshua. Now most of these are known as the books of law, but Joshua creeps in there as well. It's related. The characters are Moses, Pharaoh, Aaron, Miriam, Joshua and Caleb. And the date is understood to be 1800 to 1300 BC.
Roughly.
Thereabouts.
Now, I think it's important to pause and reflect for a moment about the first 3 parts of our series and the fact that they're all in Genesis, which is quite a significant chunk of the series, a quarter, if you will. This is because we need to understand the relationship between God and humans, which is the foundation for the rest of the story we're going to uncover. And as you will have noticed from what Clem just said, part 4 is covering 5 books. Well, 4 and a bit.
5 books? We've only got a few minutes today, Grace.
Indeed. Therefore, in part 4, we're going to follow our 2 main characters, Moses and Joshua.
Okay. Last week we left off with Joseph dying and the 12 tribes of Israel remaining in Egypt. So how did we get from there to looking at Moses today?
Well, when Joseph is about to die, he tells his brothers that God will surely come to their aid and take them up out of the land of Egypt to the land that he has promised them. You may have noticed when we were going through the story of the patriarchs that some of the times when God was speaking to Abraham, Isaac or Jacob, he would not only talk about the great nation that will come out of them, but also talked about a specific land that he would give them for the nation to live in.
That must be the promised land. Okay, but you still haven't told us where Moses is coming in, one of our main characters today. Come on.
Well, Joseph and the Pharaoh he was serving at the time got on really well. So the nation of Israel settled happily in Egypt. But as time went on and the Pharaoh died and a new Pharaoh replaced him, he felt threatened by the growing nation of Israel. And so Pharaoh enslaved them. However, the more that he enslaved them and oppressed them, the more they grew and increased and spread. This happened for about 400 years before we come to the story of Moses.
So we can see that God's promises still stood, right? Because even though they were enslaved, the nation from Abraham continued to grow.
That's right. But then Pharaoh went a step further and gave the order that every Hebrew boy that was born must be thrown in the Nile. But they could let the girls live.
But what? That is completely insane.
Indeed. But this is where Moses comes in. We read in Exodus chapter 2. Clem?
Now, a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman.
And if I can stop you there, Clem.
That's only one verse, Grace.
I know, but it's an important verse, and you could easily miss it. Moses, who we're going to see God call to lead the nation of Israel out of Egypt, is not from the line of Joseph. He's the son of a man from the tribe of Levi. And the Levites, what we'll see, will become the priestly tribe. He doesn't follow the progression of leadership that we've seen in the previous part we looked at, the patriarchs, where we saw a pattern of passing on father, son, father, son. We see this shift happen in Genesis when Jacob, Joseph's father, blesses his 12 sons as the 12 tribes of Israel. And the nation begins to function as a tribal nation.
Okay, so then why did God pick Moses from the tribe of Levi?
Well, it's a bit like Abraham. We can't ever know why God makes these choices, but what we do know is that God has a plan for each of our lives, and he invites us to partner with him. He gives us opportunities to trust and obey his leading.
Okay, I get that. Shall I carry on?
Yep.
So, a man from the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. When Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking alongside the riverbank, she saw that the basket among the reeds was there and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered, and the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water."
I think it's fair to say that Moses didn't have the calmest of starts to life.
No siree.
But we see that God makes a way in the midst of a crisis for the nation of Israel. Through the very decree that Pharaoh meant for harm, God uses Pharaoh's own daughter to rescue the person who will rescue Israel.
But how is Moses going to rescue Israel? Does he even know that he's a Hebrew?
Yes, Moses knew he was a Hebrew. And to cut a long story short, he witnesses the injustice that his own people are living in. He kills an Egyptian that had been beating one of his own people. Pharaoh finds out and tries to kill him, so he flees Egypt to a land called Midian.
Yikes.
It gets weirder. Moses is then living in Midian. He marries a woman named Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, who is a priest of Midian. He becomes a shepherd, and one day when he is tending his flock in the wilderness and comes to Horeb, the mountain of God, he witnesses a bush on fire that doesn't burn up.
Say what?
I know. God meets Moses and says he has seen the suffering of his people in Egypt and that he intends to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And he says to Moses, "I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt."
But surely Pharaoh's just going to kill him if he goes back to Egypt. And how is Moses going to get Pharaoh to let hundreds of slaves go free?
Well, you're starting to sound a little bit like Moses, Clem. He couldn't see how he was going to do this either. He wasn't even very good at speaking to people in public. He was also concerned that the Israelites wouldn't actually believe him, that God had sent him to them.
So what does God do? Give Moses his signature and a big stick to whack 'em all with? Come on!
Well, you're not a million miles away there, Clem. God tells Moses his divine name. I am who I am.
I am what I am.
Not now,
and
Clem. There is so much more we could say about that, but I think we'll leave that for another time. What we do know is that God knew that that would be enough for the Israelites to know that he had sent Moses. God also provides Moses with signs to show the people that God is with him. So his staff, or a big stick, will turn into a snake in front of Pharaoh and part the Red Sea, which is a bit later in the story, for example. So Moses returns to Egypt.
Well, I know this bit. This is when we get all of the plagues sent on Egypt when Pharaoh doesn't let the people go, right? There's blood, frogs, gnats, flies, livestock killed, boils sent, hails rained down, locusts, the night of darkness, and then the plague on the firstborn sons and animals. God sends all of these upon Egypt, and still Pharaoh will not let the Israelites go free, right?
Sadly, yes. We want to focus on the final plague, the plague of the firstborn sons in Egypt. We see the story come full circle. God judges Pharaoh and the people of Egypt for the enslavement of Israel and the denial of their freedom by doing to them what they had done to his people. And this is where we see the event of Passover happen. All those of Israel took a lamb to use for the meal that evening, and they used some of the blood to paint their doorframe of their house. This was a sign to God that when he passed over Egypt, that he was to pass over their house and not bring judgment upon the firstborn humans and the livestock of that house. So God makes a way for them to be saved.
Well, some of us celebrated Passover on Thursday with the church online, didn't we? Why are we still celebrating it now, all these years later?
Well, do you remember what I said last week about lambs in the Old Testament?
Yes. Lambs, generally, in the Old Testament represent Jesus. So, what you're saying is, the Last Supper, in which Jesus has his last meal with his friends before he dies, was actually a Passover meal.
It was the festival of Passover. And so this is another foretelling of what Jesus is going to do, of dying in our place, so that when God's judgment comes, his blood will protect us, like the lamb's blood protected the people of Israel. He makes a way for us.
That's so awesome. Okay, but this part today that we're looking at is called Out of Egypt. And we're still in Egypt at the moment. What's going on here?
Well, how do you think Moses felt? Well, finally, Pharaoh lets the Israelites go, as God said he would. So Moses leads the Israelites through the Red Sea. God makes a way, quite literally, by parting the waters. They cross and they end up in the desert.
Desert? That doesn't sound very good.
Well, God's with them. They have a pillar of fire to guide them at night and a pillar of cloud to guide them by day. They do start to get a bit thirsty and hungry, so they grumble, but God still makes a way by providing food for them and water. And on the first day of the 3rd month after they've left Egypt, they come to the desert of Sinai, where there's this big mountain. And where does God meet people?
In the desert?
No, Clem. On a mountain. Remember that. And this is where we hit the topic of law.
Ah,